Okay. I'll just let Simon sit down. Good evening and welcome to the Audit Standards Committee meeting of Melton Borough Council. Members are reminded that we will be using the audio visual system this evening, and the meeting will also be streamed live on YouTube. Members are asked to physically raise their hands in the usual way to indicate they wish to speak and to use their microphones when speaking for the benefit of all present. The microphone is live when the red light displays. Please switch mobile phones to silent. I will now provide a reminder of the evacuation procedure. In the event of having to evacuate the council chamber, please leave by one of the 6 emergency exits around the sides of the chamber. Please assemble at the far side of the front car park, nearest to the park entrance. Officers will be on hand to assist persons who require any assistance. Public recording of the meeting. There is legislation that allows the public to film, record, or use social media at a council meeting. This must not be disrupted to the good order of the meeting, nor include any filming or recording of the public seating area. I am Councillor Lee Higgins, the Chairman of Audit Standards, and I confirm tonight that we have the following from Melton Borough Council in attendance tonight: the Director of Corporate Services, Dawn Garton, our new Monitoring Officer, Clive Tobin, and I would recommend members introduce yourselves probably after the meeting to Clive as well. Chief Internal Auditor Rachel Ashley Cornt, and Democratic Services Officer, and welcome back to the Council, Catherine Richards. Apologies for absence. We have a full house tonight, so there is no apologies for the record. And what I'm going to propose, but I'll probably do it a bit later, just so members are aware, I'm going to propose that we swap item 4 and 5, because item 4 has potentially of an exclusion of the public. So we will do that later. If there's any objections, please let me know now, but I'll present that later. Okay. Minutes. To confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of November. So I'd like to request that members propose it. Now, I wasn't in attendance that night, so if there is any issues on the minutes, please advise first. Otherwise, I seek a proposer. Councillor Graham and a seconder, Councillor Atherton. Thank you both. And can I have a show of hands for all those who agree to those minutes? I will abstain as I wasn't here. So that are you voting, Steve, to excellent minutes? Okay, that's carried. I think we can safely say that's fine. Yeah, and so Councillor Lumley, Carter, and myself are abstaining because we weren't at that meeting. So just for note, thank you very much. Declarations of interest. I'd like to invite any member who wish to do so and make declarations of interest in respect to the items on the meeting tonight. And if they do crop up during the debate as well, I know sometimes that has happened before, but if there are any declarations, please indicate now. Okay, that's made your job easier, Mr. New Monitoring Officer. So, okay. So I think, Dawn, you said I had to propose the swapping of the agenda. Is that right?
Chair, general meeting procedure rules say rule 11 that you may the chair will proceed with business as per the agenda unless otherwise specified by the chair in the meeting. Okay. So that would give you power to do so. There's also a power to propose that. So if a member otherwise wanted to do.
Oh yes.
Apologies. I'll repeat that for the benefit of those who could not hear before. Rule 11 of the general meeting procedure rules states that the chair will proceed with the business as per the agenda unless otherwise specified by the chair in the meeting. There is also a motion, power to move a motion to that effect without notice if another member wished to do so. So it can be done either way.
What I'll do is, as there was no indication of an objection earlier, I'll just propose that. So we'll move to item 5. Which is the counter fraud update, because that is not at risk of excluding the public on that. So what I will do, so item 5 is page 33 of your packs. I'll give you a few moments on that, but Rachel, if you'd like to open the paper up. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is just a 6-monthly update that we bring to the Audit and Standards Committee, updating on actions that the Council's taken in relation to counter fraud work. So we split it into 3 sections. So on page 34, there's a brief overview of those actions. So firstly, we look at preventative work. So this is essentially proactive work that we've undertaken to try and strengthen our counter fraud controls. So over the last 6 months, this has included a review of our policies, which were obviously approved by this committee at the last meeting. The completion of fraud awareness training for staff. We also did the Fraud Awareness Week in November, which was an opportunity to raise awareness of risks and training, and the all-staff briefing that took place as part of that Fraud Awareness Week as well. Then we've also got the detective work. So this is where we're actively looking for any areas of potential fraud or corruption. So we're looking for potential data matches that might be flags. And we do that particularly through the National Fraud Initiative exercise, which we take part in every other year. And we're currently working through those matches. Also, we did take part in an additional pilot last year, which was in relation to social housing fraud. So we've been working through that. And then the last section is around compliance. So here we're looking at what we do to get assurance about how effective our fraud controls are, how we give you assurance around how those are operating in practice. So we obviously maintain the fraud risk register. So that provides some sources of assurance around those key risks. And we also have within the audit plan, which was also on the agenda this evening, we have the audit work on council tax and business rates exemptions as well. So that's giving you some assurance around how we're complying with those controls in practice. So it's just a brief report really, Chair, just to run through those key sections. But I'm happy to take questions from the committee on anything further. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Rachel. Just one from me, and then I'll open it from the to the floor. Obviously, we've the committee's talked before about the UK SPF funding, so and some of the additional funding that's coming into the borough and the area. Obviously, that's then relating to community grants and business grants. And while counter fraud is obviously very, very broad. Obviously, when as Dawn and myself would know, when the COVID grant scheme happened, there was a whole process about to try and identify where fraud could happen, because it sometimes comes in at the weakest point or where there's sometimes less scrutiny. In terms of those and some of the spending from the UK SPF, and some of the projects, how would the council look at that? Because I know that's been something that a lot of the members have talked about outside of these meetings, and I know you've been asked those questions before, but I think as we've got some new members on the table today, and also for Clive, could you give us an update around that, and then I'll open it up to the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to contact and to advise on that. So within the audit plan for this year, we do have an allocation of days for the UK SPF work, as you mentioned. So that will include a wider coverage around how that programme is being managed, but we'd expect within that to include some assurances around the areas that you mentioned, particularly if we are giving any grants. So when we've looked at this at some other councils, they're applying their community grants policy. So I'm not sure what policies be applied here, or if it's a new set of controls, but that's something that we'll look at as part of that work. Also on the agenda this evening, you've got an update on the other audits that we've delivered. So that did within the Supporting Vulnerable People audit, that also refers to some assurances that we gave around assistance programmes for those requiring additional support and need. So we did also look at it as part of that audit, not necessarily UK SPF, but other financial assistance schemes. So it's something that we do tend to look at. As you say, it can be open to abuse if it's not applied in a consistent manner and we don't sufficiently evidence how that's been transparently completed. So hopefully that helps. And obviously, as I say, we'll be reporting back on the UK SPF work later this year.
Just on that, I know from the business side grants of the UK SPF that the council is going through is and there's been some very good praise of the officers who've worked on that in terms of the applications that come in, and there's various different counter fraud measures that go through before it even gets presented to a decision-making part, and there's lots of different checks and balances that go on there. For example, is like if you're applying is making sure if you're a limited company that those are all checked through, and to make sure that those who apply for it are on the tin, so to speak. And I would like to pass my congratulations to the team, which is headed by Lee Byrne, on there, for the work that they've done on what I saw from the UK SPF funding from there. But if there's any other questions from members to Rachel, please fire ahead now. Yes, Councillor Atherton.
Right, so just one quick question. In the prevention section, sorry, in the detection section, subparagraph F, you talk about you've enabled cleansing of tenancy data. What does that mean, please?
Through you, Chair. So yes, so this has been a really interesting exercise. So this was a new exercise that the Cabinet Office were running. And they went out to all councils and said, if anyone wants to participate, that we can take part. So we did express an interest, and we were lucky enough to get onto that pilot. So that was essentially matching our tenancy records to other sources of data from other areas of the public sector, but also things like from the Financial Regulation Authority as well. So it was matching people to properties. So it was looking primarily at any tenants we believe to be in our social housing who were actually linked to other properties, which could mean they've moved out and they're subletting the property. It also looked at other people matched to our properties to, again, look at potential subletting or tenancies that we're not aware of, and also deceased data as well. So we were identifying cases where the tenant we had named on a property had actually deceased, and then we were finding out who was matched to that property. So that's been a really useful exercise. And as I've mentioned here, it hasn't necessarily resulted in any formal outcomes as at this time. And some of those are subject to ongoing investigation. But what it has enabled us to do is actually to work through and identify where tenancies have changed, but the data on our system hasn't been updated. So that means that we actually have a much better source of information to take part in data matching going forward. So it may be, for example, that we had a tenancy that's on our system as a joint tenancy for a couple, but they've actually separated and they're now living in separate addresses. This exercise has been able to prompt us to make sure actually we've got the right tenant linked to our property and that data is fully up to date. So that cleansing has been really useful to make sure we've got our right data. As at today, we've actually, as an additional development on this, we've just been accepted onto another pilot, which is stage 2 of this piece of work. And this is actually potentially looking at matching against other sources of data, including Airbnb data. So that's an opportunity to see whether any properties are actually being let out via any of those platforms as well. So it's something that we're actively participating in. A lot of councils are not bothering to do it or don't have the resource, but we're trying to take these opportunities where we can. So I think that's been a positive.
So thank you very much. I look forward to some detail in a future report. Sounds quite interesting, actually, but thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak on this item at all? Okay, well, the recommendations to note the progress made, and also underneath, I've got to report that the Cabinet have also noted this report as well. I don't know what date it doesn't say a date on here, but it's obviously gone to Cabinet. So I think a good piece of work there, Rachel. And I know from what members are saying, sometimes, as I say, out of the formal part of the committee is members are very engaged on this type of paperwork. So I will move on. So item 4, which we moved after item 5. So this is the internal audit progress report. I just want to highlight that Appendix B is exempt, and should members wish to comment or discuss the contents of the exempt appendix, the committee will need to resolve that we need to exclude the public while the discussion takes place. And while there's no members of the public in the chamber, Catherine will need to pause the YouTube recording. So I can either do that now if anyone wants to talk about Appendix B, or we could start it all off. But if members can just be aware that Appendix B is exempt. So if you're happy, Rachel, I can hand over to yourself, and if there is anything you want to talk about in the exempt paper, we can go to that motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So as you say, if we can focus on the content of Appendix A for the purpose of this discussion, but obviously if any members want to discuss Appendix B, we can go into private session to do so. So this is the latest update on the delivery of this year's internal audit plan. So in the usual format, the latest copy of the plan is provided from page 21 of your papers this evening. So this provides each of the audits that we are delivering this financial year, the current status of each of those and the outcomes of those which have been finalised. So we remain on track in terms of delivery of the audit plan by the end of March. So we have a target set of at least 90% to at least draft report stage, which we remain on track to deliver. So within the body of the report is an update on those audits that have been finalised since the last meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee. So these are in section 2.5 of the paper on Appendix A from page 17. So we've had 3 audit reports that have been finalised since the last committee meeting. So I'll just talk members briefly through each of those and I'd be happy to take any questions on those as well. So the first is in relation to environmental health. So this is obviously one of the Standards Council services. As part of this audit, we wanted to get assurance over the council's compliance with regulations and policies. It's one of those highly regulated areas. So we wanted to get some assurance around the controls that are operating here. So on a positive note, we did note some proactive work that had been undertaken in terms of engagement and networking with other local groups, the setting up of the landlord forum as well as a proactive step to try and engage with landlords and give guidance on some of those new regulations around damp and mould, for example, and working collaboratively with our partners. However, we were only able to give a moderate assurance opinion overall, both on the design of the controls and the compliance, and that was primarily due to the fact that the record keeping in this area was not fit for purpose, because it did not enable us to conduct sample testing, for example, to actually give an assurance opinion around the compliance. So what we would expect to be able to perform on this audit is to obtain a report of all of the complaints and all of the enforcement cases over the last 12 months. But because of how these are logged and there is not a central case management system, we were not able to get that population and produce and select a sample that we could test. So that obviously impacted upon the assurance opinion we were able to give. There's also a lack of documented procedures in place, so we couldn't give assurance that consistent processes are being applied and how those have been documented and captured for staff. We also noted an issue around the documentation of some of the sub-delegations. So within the scheme of delegation, there is some delegation to the relevant director around environmental health powers. But we did note that there was some decisions that were being taken by the Environmental Health Registration Board, which actually weren't suitably documented within those delegations. So again, that needs to be formalised and documented appropriately. Overall, as I say, we've given a moderate assurance opinion on both areas and a medium organisational impact. So that's reflected on page 18. The next report was in relation to supporting vulnerable people. So this was a very different review. So this is less around a regulatory service, more around how we are proactively engaging with our community, how we were supporting vulnerable people and how we're meeting our objectives in this area. So we do have some legal duties, so we wanted to make sure that we could give assurance around how those are being met. But we also wanted to look at how Melton is adapting to the needs of residents, how we're supporting them when they're in need, and also how those mechanisms demonstrate value for money and how they're being complied with. So overall, we noted some good areas of working. So the integrated people offer that's being applied, good record keeping that was in place. So we were able to see the individuals that we're supporting, enabling a good audit trail there. We also saw evidence of good collaboration, both with voluntary organisations and with other public sector bodies, again, supporting that proactive work with vulnerable people within the community. The recommendations we made were primarily around needing a service plan to try and coordinate and bring together all of the different areas and the good work that's being done, and looking at publishing the local community trigger data, which is a requirement under the Anti-Social Behaviour Crime and Policing Act. So that's including facts around the number of applications, for example, the number of reviews that have been completed. So we should be publishing that annually. So and there were some issues around some of the information that was online on that. So those were some of the recommendations that were made. So on that basis, we've given a good level of assurance around the control environment. There's a lot going on. It's being well delivered, but we've given a moderate assurance opinion on the basis of those recommendations that have been made. And the third report was in relation to the management of our leisure contract. So obviously the current contract actually comes to an end in March 2024. So whilst we wanted to give assurance around how this contract's being managed, to make sure that it's managed efficiently, that we're getting the best value for money from the contract, the focus really is on how we make sure this is built into the new contract from April 2024 onwards. And we tried to work with officers to make sure that we made recommendations that could be taken forward in that way. So essentially, we're only, again, able to give a moderate assurance opinion on the control environment and the compliance at the time of the audit. And this was primarily around the lack of performance management mechanisms that we were able to see from the audit. So what we would like to see being built into the formal contract going forward is some specific performance targets, potentially financial penalties that can be applied if those are not met. We also wanted to see the formalisation around site inspections. So whilst these were taking place during the course of the last contract, we didn't see formal documentation around what was actually checked during that visit, what were the outcomes. So just something like a template checklist would help to document that going forward and make sure that the outcomes are taken forward with officers and with the contractor appropriately. So as I say, there's a moderate assurance opinion there and a medium organisational impact, again, due to the size of that contract. So also within the report is an update on the implementation of open audit recommendations. So this is in Appendix 2 on page 25. So we've had 7 audit recommendations have been implemented since I last reported to you in November. We've also had we also still have 9 which are within 3 months of being overdue, but we currently have 27 which are over 3 months overdue as at the time of reporting. So what we usually do with the committee as normal is focus on those within the high priority bracket, which are over 3 months overdue. So I've provided full details for you of those on pages 26 and 27. And as mentioned, this also goes into Appendix B for details on that 4th action. There is also an additional recommendation on the paper this evening regarding an amendment to the audit plan. So within the audit plan coverage, as you can see on page 21 at the bottom there, we have 15 days allocated to an audit of the asset development plan. We started planning on this audit and it became apparent that actually some of the timescales had moved since the audit plan for 23-24 had been agreed, and actually it would give greater assurance if we were to postpone this audit into the next financial year. So it's proposed that that be deferred to next year's audit plan, and we could reallocate those days to an audit on procurement compliance. So this is an audit that we usually do on an annual basis, but because we had such a packed audit plan this year, we weren't able to fit that in. It is actually an audit we always do in Q4, so it's quite timely if we were to reinstate that audit. And I think it would be good use of those days if we were to reallocate that to that procurement compliance testing. And it just helps to inform your annual value for money opinion if we can do that audit particularly. So that's an additional recommendation in the paper this evening. And I think that's a run through of the report, Chair, but I'm happy to take any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Again, just to remind the committee about the exemption on Appendix B if anyone wants to raise that, but I'll unless anyone moves that from the floor, I'm going to keep this session open. So Councillor Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 questions, and they're basically contradictory questions. The environmental health reporting is really not up to standard. It's had a lot of change of personnel, certainly at the top, the environmental health department. Is this a new problem that has come in with a new management, or is it something that's been a hangover from the past management?
Through you, Chair. So obviously with as you rightly mentioned, it has been an area that's been subject to change in personnel, and that was actually the reason it hit our risk radar as an area to give assurance on this year, as obviously changes in personnel often give rise to additional risk. The testing that we perform is only on the current financial year, so we wouldn't be able to say how far back this went in terms of the issues or the gaps that we've identified. So I wouldn't want to be able to comment on that too far. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think it's an interesting point to raise, just to see with the new management getting our feet under the table. One doesn't want past practices failing. The second one is a totally different question in a way. It's to do with vulnerable people and analysis and reporting and everything else. I remember a long time ago, there was a great phrase called paralysis by analysis. And you will find that really vulnerable people, it's lots of individual cases. And I'm very worried that we make the thing too regularized. We won't be able to concentrate so much on those individual cases, of which I think this council deals incredibly well. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Through you, Chair, I think that's probably a question better taken by the service area in terms of the approach to individuals. Obviously, what all we wanted to see as part of the audit was how those records are maintained. So where we are supporting individuals with all different needs, we wanted to see that how that was captured. And as we've mentioned in here, we were pleased with those levels of records and the audit trail that was in place. I think it's important that there is this integrated people offer. I think it is about understanding emerging needs. It's about developing our what we're able to offer as a council in light of those changes as well. So hopefully it's not that it becomes anything that's too rigid, that it no longer meets needs, and hopefully it develops with those. But obviously we've mentioned about developing a service plan as well. So that helps to coordinate that and make sure that we're moving in the right direction with the work as well.
With your permission, then, Councillor Graham, could we ask that question to Michelle Howard? Because you were saying about the service area, and then an update back to the committee, but it can be just in writing. That would be fine, and then probably put that in. Then, yeah, thank you. For good questions, Councillor Carter.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just picking up on Councillor Graham. Yeah, I'm the chairman for environmental health and licensing. Yeah, we have had a problem in there with staffing and management, and we're getting to grips of it, and we are recruiting now, and they're getting back to full strength on that side of it. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Carter. You didn't have a question or anything either. You didn't, because that was just a response. Yeah, thank you. Okay, Councillor Mason, and then Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I have a concern, Chair. If we can just turn to Appendix 2, page 25, in the report, I look at that and I get no sense from that we are actually dealing with the recommendations, and there is no plan in place for service areas to implement the recommendations that have been put forward. In fact, when I read back across the papers of previous audit committees, rather than the recommendation action plan diminishing, they're actually growing. At 19, I just wonder whether Rachel would like to comment. Would a council of this size, with 19 outstanding medium priority recommendations over 3 months, do you think that is a large number, and should I be concerned?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so I'm equally concerned that when we see increasing levels of overdue audit recommendations, particularly in that over 3 months category, and I would suggest 19 out of the total. I mean, there's 43 in total of audit recommendations which were due. So I think 27 of those being over 3 months overdue, that's 63%, as you can see in the table. And I think that is a high level of overdue audit recommendations. I've obviously been working with Meltons for some time, and it has been creeping up in recent times, and it's something that I have discussed with the senior leadership team. So again, it's something that if the committee was minded to do so, that's something we can take back to reiterate that the committee has some concerns in that area. As you've mentioned, particularly those medium priority risks, some committees in that Appendix 3 that I've provided is obviously just high priority actions. Some of my audit committees require that to be high and medium. So that would actually be a very long table if we were to do that, obviously, in these circumstances. But that's something, obviously, the committee, if you were minded to do so, that's something you could do if you were concerned.
Would it be possible for someone to come to the committee on particularly on the ones that are outstanding for some time, and report to the committee to tell us what the action plan is and how they intend to deal with it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Councillor Mason, and I think probably you and I could probably sit down with Rachel and the SLT team, because one, to find out where the areas are, what they're doing, and then to either report back to the committee outside of the meeting. But again, I think it is important where probably someone wants to come and then explain to the committee and then the action plan to make sure it's being dealt with. It's not constantly being slipped. Because while we've got the statistic pages here, there could be something that all in one particular service area. And yeah, with your assistance there, Rachel, we'd just like to keep on top of that. And I think, as we were saying before, weren't we, Councillor Mason, this committee has a responsibility to full council and to make sure that we're holding the council to account that way. So if we could do that, we could set a meeting with yourself and the vice chair, and then if it's a large piece of work, we could probably delegate a little bit of it to other members of the committee should they want to get involved in something. But I think it's important we keep an eye on it. So if we start off, if permission with the committee, if you're happy with that, myself and the vice chair work on that to start with, to bring to back to the next committee, I'm happy to take that forward. If you are, Jim, yeah, okay.
Yes, Chair. I'm happy with that, Chair. For you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm afraid it's back to page 17 in environmental services. And I welcome the comments from Councillor Carter, and it's clear that there's an appreciation of the need to improve in that area. And my comments are made against the background of being fully aware that across local government, not just here in Melton, environmental services has been quite challenging, particularly in terms of recruitment and the maintenance of the retention of professional staff. However, when I read this, I was quite concerned because where it refers to not having a case management system, not being able to obtain a reportable complaints and enforcement cases, as there was no record capturing that, it seemed to me that's another way of saying we've no way of knowing whether complaints received have been acted on or not. And then when we go down and remind ourselves of the areas in which environmental health is active, and the one that jumped out at me was actually private sector housing conditions. And then thinking about the recent tragic case of a child in one of the northern authorities that was found the cause of that child's death was actually the mouldy and in appalling conditions in their housing. That sent alarm bells ringing with me. And my question, though, having set the scene, is having said all of that, and I read that as saying at the moment we don't have a robust system of ensuring we're acting on complaints. If we're not recording them, we don't know if we're acting on them. And we end up saying it's only a medium risk to the authority. Now, with all due respect, if we were to face the sort of tragedy that occurred in that northern authority, I think the risk to the authority is higher than medium. So I'm interested to know why that view was taken. It seems to me that the importance of attaching what the level of risk is, it focuses the organisation on the importance of resolving things. So I just welcome some comments on that, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just before I hand over to Rachel or to any of the other officers, there has been since we've formed this new committee where either members of the public, either through informal channels or have contacted ward members where complaints are raised and they feel it's got lost in an ether. And equally, it can then be hard for the ward member to act upon it, representing their resident, or you know, if it's not been captured correctly, or there is no way of tracking it through. And so we, throughout that, and I know I've spoken to other members of the committee, anything that does come in needs to obviously certainly be in ideally writing, and it needs to be tracked through. And you raise a really good point. And I think I speak for all members, all 28 of us. If you only need one case where it goes horribly wrong, and from not just the reputational risk of the council, and obviously the professional officers who work in their time, it is also reflecting on us as councillors, and we're there again to hold the council to account. And we don't want to see it go wrong. And I think we said it may have been, it wasn't the last meeting because I wasn't here, but the meeting before, and we had some training about the risk and how to manage risk. And I thought we had very good direction from the officers, is sometimes please challenge and challenge robustly. I'll go back to you then, Mike, and then after you finish, Rachel or any of the officers can comment on that.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that, your comments are very useful, but of course, complaints don't just come from elected members, and often people will go through other channels than through. So we wouldn't be aware of the issues, and my concern really is it does only take one case. I'm very reluctant to talk about protecting the brand or reputational damage in the light of recent public hearings going on this week, because it's a bit of a poison thing, but it is about attaching the right level of priority to resolving this, and that being reflected in the risk assessment given.
Yes, so just to comment on that. So obviously the medium organisational risk does demonstrate that there is a risk exposed. I think the reason we've gone from a medium organisational impact rather than high, which we very rarely do, it would be something that is, we expect an imminent threat essentially, based on the findings. In this particular case, there was an arrangement in place with Harborough District Council. So we did see that there was a new management in place. There was support in terms of strengthening processes, and the direction of travel was a positive one during the course of the audit. So there was a full agreement on the actions that needed to be taken. Overall, while obviously the key recommendations, as we talked about, was around the record keeping, and that was the main high priority recommendation. So there was one high priority recommendation. The others were of medium priority or low priority. So overall, that's the basis on which we've reached that conclusion, and that's on the whole and control framework that we've looked at as part of the audit. So where we were able to conduct sample testing, whilst we weren't able to select a random sample that we'd expect to do, where we did look at a sample of inspections, for example, generally the evidence base was there to demonstrate that the process had been followed. Of a sample of 15 that we looked at, we had some gaps in the records around 2 of those, but the others did seem to be compliant with the controls we expected to see. So on that basis, that's why we've reached a medium organisational impact. So I just wanted to comment on that. Also, just to add further, obviously there's been reference there around the private sector housing element. This is something that I'm really mindful of, and it's something that's definitely high up on my risk agenda as well. And I just wanted to reassure the committee that it's one of the areas that's at the top of my list currently for the audit plan coverage for 24-25 to look specifically around public sector housing enforcement as well. So we'll be looking at that area a lot deeper in the next year, hopefully.
I just wanted to come on the private sector housing, because when you if you look.
Sorry, Dawn. I don't know if I need to declare an interest or any other members, but I'm a landlord who has private housing in the Melton Borough area and other areas, but if I have an interest, then please let me know if you're going to talk about private housing.
Very generally.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't know if any other people are landlords as well, but if that's noted with the monitoring officer, thank you.
What I was going to say, Chair, was that recognising that there needs to be an enhanced focus in this area, and that we do have limited capacity at the current time and expertise. The budget proposals that are coming forward do contain a proposal for a growth item in this area. So, we are mindful of this, and there is that opportunity to members to vote through additional resources through those budget proposals.
Thank you, Chair. Just one comment to pick up. The reference in the report to the lack of specific enforcement policies for health and safety, environmental protection and private sector housing is of some concern, but we do have a corporate enforcement policy which does first set a process and give general guiding principles. So although it's true that this could be expanded on, this is not something which is completely without any format or procedure. It needs improving, definitely, but I just want to assure members that it's not as if we have nothing in place at all.
The only thing I will say, well, I won't talk about necessarily too much on the private sector. What I do know, where as a ward councillor, that's some, and again, probably other ward councillors had issues with, is where some antisocial behaviour stems out of some private sector housing. It can be more difficult for the authorities to tackle that than when it was either a public sector or housing association housing, and that can create difficulties and tensions for those complaining about that. And I know that there are organisations for private sector housing that they can improve their understanding of how to be a good landlord and how to be a responsible landlord, not just for the tenant, but also the neighbourhood and community. But I would leave that in a very general discussion there as well. Any other comments from Councillor Brown?
No, I mean, I welcome the response that have been made, and particularly the proposal in the budget for some strengthening that area of enforcement, which I think is important. However, where this still leaves me is uncertain where this is going next, and when will we know that improvements have been made in this service to ensure that the record keeping and the logs are actually up to the standard that's required, because it's a little open-ended here. There's a recommendation about case management, but it's very unclear as to a timescale for that. So again, I think it would be helpful if we have a further report at some stage later in the year that actually can hopefully indicate that we've improved that whole process.
Chair, in one specific area regarding private sector housing enforcement, it was mentioned in the report, and I'm sure you're aware of it. Generally, there are some new provisions which have come to place, and it's following the case that you referred to earlier regarding the death of the child concerned. But there is an internal board being set up to oversee implementation of that act. So some of these things will go hand in hand with that, because there are new obligations, there's new statutory roles, there's new statutory duties. And of course, and to go with that, we need to have a clear framework of enforcement. So that's something that can be picked up by that board.
Thank you, Chair. Just to mention in terms of the action plan that was mentioned, so in the record keeping is subject to a recommendation which is due for implementation by April this year. And that's the same timescale that's been applied to a number of the actions. There was one that's already been completed, one that was February, one January, but those main ones were based around April implementation. So obviously, if they do not get implemented, they will start to feature on your overdue audit action radar as well. If members wanted any specific follow-up, obviously we can do that. But as I've said, what I'm proposing next year is a specific review of private sector housing enforcement. So that would be giving you some assurance around a specific area within this area, rather than doing a full follow-up again of the wider controls. So hopefully that's giving some assurance.
Yeah, and just on that, and well, just to touch on the interest again. I mean, I as a landlord, I very much welcome private sector housing getting involved in this, because you get very good landlords, and you only need a rogue one who pays no attention to any of the legislation. But if the monitoring officer obviously can provide guidance for if this crops up, and for anyone who may have interests or rent there, because I know some members are landlords as well. If we're straying into those interests, because I don't want any of the members to trip up on that, as this one seems to crop up. So if I can pass that to you, Clive, for future advice, that would be very helpful. I think you was going to, Councillor Atherton.
So just an observation on the ticketing system again. Really, I find it incredible that we're in 2024 and we don't seem to have a joined up ticketing system from which you can get this information. I personally find it fundamental to the operation of not just issues relating to housing, but issues relating to anything that you have a ticketing system, whether it's one specific to housing, one specific to environmental health, or one single ticketing system that covers anything. I don't see how we can have operated as a council for all these years without one, to be fair. and I find it strange that it's taken an audit of this nature to highlight that fact. Albeit, that said, I am glad that you have highlighted it and that we're going to put it right. The other point I'd like to raise is to do with the assurance options or opinions rather that are shown. They show the snapshot based on this current audit, but what they don't give me any indication of, and I'm sure I could do it myself if I've got the time to go into past reports, is where an item has been audited previously, it gives me no indication at a glance as to whether we're trending improvement or, dare I say it, trending down the way, or whether we're just stood still. So I don't know if there's a way we can add that into future reports.
Through you, Chair. So based on the scope of potential internal audit coverage, we don't tend to revisit the same area every year or every other year like we perhaps would have done in past, and now that we do risk-based audit planning. So it does mean that some of these areas, and like we've mentioned here on the environmental health, haven't been subject to an audit in the last 5 years. So what we would generally do, if the audit has been performed in the last few years, we would mention it in this summary and say what the assurance opinion was at the last audit. So if for example, one that we might do regularly is the procurement compliance that I mentioned. So we'd usually look at what the assurance was last year and any recommendations which we'd follow up as part of that audit. So as I say, in these cases, we haven't got a comparator because we haven't visited that area before. And generally, we will be looking at quite diverse areas. It is very risk-based. Any that was standard, we would try to reference it within this report. So hopefully that gives you that information going forward.
Okay, well, thank you, members. And I thought there were some really good points made there. And Catherine, I think if we could just take some of the points that the members from the floor were asking as well, make sure that they're in the minutes, because I think what some members were suggesting is not to let it slip away. So I think like Councillor Brown and Councillor Atherton were pointing out there, and Councillor Mason, and put that in the make sure that's captured in the minutes. It helps jog our memory when we read this at the next meeting. That's what we asked for, and we get the nudge, and then we'd probably ask the officers, and then hopefully that's reported on in the next paper. Because without being too post office about it, is when things get forgotten, and you know, decisions are taken, and then it runs away from you if we forget it, and then you know, committees may change all the other stuff, and it's important to have a good handover. So if that can be captured in the minutes, I really appreciate that, Catherine. Okay, so I will move for the recommendations. So the 2-1 is to note, but I'll just take it on block anyway, because well, that's note. As Rachel mentioned, to approve the amendment for the internal audit plan for 2023-24, and to remove the audit of the asset development plan and replace with assurance over procurement compliance. I thought Rachel explained the reason very well behind that recommendation, but if there is any comment before we move to the vote on that point, very happy to take it now, but I don't think there is. Okay, so I will move that now. Can I have a seconder from Councillor Brown? I will go all those in favour, and that's unanimous. That's great. Thank you very much, members. So urgent business. So I don't have any urgent business at all, but if there is anything from the floor for anything either for myself or Councillor Mason at all, happy to take that, but I don't think so. No members indicating. So I'm happy to close the meeting at 19:18, which is quite poignant. So thank you very much, members.